I've been working on and off on a translation of Jacob of Edessa's 5th Memra on the 4th day of creation. This Memra covers creatures of the waters and the air, as in the biblical text. I noticed when I was doing this translation that Jacob suddenly starts using types of bird behavior in order to speak about desirable human behavior. And at the end of this section, he sums up what his purpose has been in doing this. He says, "In its love of virtue, this investigative treatise has selected these examples of birds and others like them that excite praise and emulation in industrious and studious people by the laudable ways and habits that nature, the creator, bestowed on a few species of bird. This was so that they might act as a reproof and inspire zeal in the free will of human reason and thought, whose choice has not been what is good and commendable, whether that is chastity or knowledge or docility or calmness or discipline or any of the virtues, even though such people are like these birds that lack reason and thought. This discussion has now dealt with the commendable habits among birds that are worthy of emulation." First, some background to Jacob's Hexa Amaren. This is his series of treatises on the 6 days of creation, and it marks the culmination of his life's work. He must have started writing in about 705 AD, and had not quite finished the 7th and final Memra when he died suddenly on his way to resume being Bishop of Edessa in June 708. Now, hexaemeral works were far from a new genre when he was writing in the early 8th century. They effectively started with the Jewish writer Philo of Alexandria in the early 1st century. Philo had tried to connect the biblical narrative of the 6 days of creation with Greek philosophical and scientific ideas. Several Greek Christian writers then developed the genre in different ways. We have the allegorizing treatise of Anastasius of Sinai, the homilies of Basil, which I'll refer to a bit later, Jacob of Serug's Memre on the days of creation, the philosophic scientific treatise of the Miaphysite John Philoponus, as well as Ambrose in Latin, which of course Jacob would not have been aware of. By the early 8th century, when Jacob started writing, he had plenty of material available to him and plenty of choices for the precise form his hexaemeron could take. The actual hexaemeron that he produced is a kind of exegetical encyclopedia. It was apparently written, according to a remark that he makes in the work, as a kind of legacy to his students at Tel Adda because he had no children of his own. It is very difficult to trace all the sources and to analyze what Jacob did with them. Some of the earlier Memre, the more cosmological ones, have been studied by Marina Greatorix in her Cardiff University PhD. At the moment, the most available translation is by Vaschalder in Latin, and Jacob's Syriac is not easy to present in an accessible English form. You're noting that the text I've just read out, Jacob never uses one word where he could use 2 or even 3, and that sounds very unnatural in English, which means that I'm kind of retranslating my own English literal translation into something that sounds as if it was written in English. So, turning back to Memra 5 in particular, it should be clear that Jacob is no zoologist when you start reading his work. People in antiquity generally depended heavily on what the Greek thinker Aristotle said about many things, and a compendious history of animals was one of Aristotle's most influential works. Although Aristotle carefully observed much of what he recorded, in that he was quite unusual, he had no binoculars and no microscope. His classifications of animals were ahead of their time in that they used points of difference and points of similarity in order to classify types and species. But of course, since the 19th century, if not earlier, scientists would classify species very differently. And so often there's a kind of mismatch between our classifications and what Aristotle and people who followed him would have done with the material. Also, the sheer amount of material that Aristotle wrote meant that most generations accessed his history of animals and other works in boiled down versions that focused on the most interesting species and left out the boring ones. As time went on, there was a tendency to garble this information even further and also use it to make a moral rather than a scientific purpose. So we find works like the Physiologus, which is an early, perhaps 3rd or 4th century AD, Greek Christian text that provides animal and bird behavior in sort of brief anecdotes along with a moral commentary. And this genre of moralizing zoology lasted well into the medieval period in the form of bestiary texts in Western Europe. There was at least one form of a Syriac Physiologus that maybe was around for Jacob to consult. It's hard to say. And it seems likely that he had some knowledge of a greatly condensed version of Aristotle on animals. Now, I was going to give a rather nice example of the way traditions had developed over time and been sort of accessed by different people and embellished or altered in various ways. And there's a nice example of the kingfisher, which I will actually skip over now, just so we don't run out of time. It will be on the handout, which I hope will appear soon. So Jacob on birds as moral examples. Now, there are Jewish antecedents for the use of birds as moral examples. This goes back, I think, to the tradition of interpretation of the lists of clean and unclean animals. This starts with Jewish thinkers writing in Greek who lived in Egypt and the diaspora, and they often felt the need to justify their dietary laws in the law of Moses from a philosophical point of view. Presumably their Gentile neighbours didn't understand why they avoided pork and so on. So for them it was not enough to say that God commanded not to eat a certain thing. They actually had to explain why he had said that. So, though the biblical text does not make this explicit, most of the unclean birds in the list in Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 are actually carnivorous. They're either birds of prey or scavengers who eat carrion. So these birds were to be avoided on 2 counts, according to writers like Philo and Aristeas. First, because of what they consumed, especially dead bodies, which was a point of hygiene. And second, because of their cruel nature. And so we're shading into the moral aspect of clean and unclean. This kind of argument is given to the figure of the high priest in the work known as the Letter of Aristeas, and similarly in Philo of Alexandria 2 centuries later. There are some quotes on the handout, which I'll leave to look up later. So the mix of pagan Greek moralistic fable, coupled with Jewish and Christian allegorization, leads, I believe, to the use of animals or birds as moral examples in treatises on creation. Basil of Caesarea does this for good pastoral reasons in the late 4th century in his homilies on the 6 days of creation. He tells his congregation that if birds, insects, and beasts can display a kind of wisdom and morality, so should his hearers. Now, Jacob follows suit, and I think it's clear he has a very strong debt to Basil in many ways, but particularly here. Though I expect that his audience, his student audience in the monastery of Tel Ada, were also able to access Basil directly and not merely through Jacob's own work. This may explain why Jacob in his Hexa Amaren apparently brings in some new examples as well, not just plagiarizing bits of Basil. And he has an extensive discussion of storks, and which I will focus on mainly today, in which the moral aspect of his explanation is prominent. So first of all, storks care for their elderly parents. I have got the quotation or part of it on the handout, on the text here. First of all, Jacob brings up a well-known tradition about storks' supposed care for their elderly parents. He says, "Now concerning what naturalists have recorded about storks, how should their knowledge, discernment, and sense of justice not be cause for praise and admiration? How could it not act as a reproach and condemnation of those who treat their parents with disrespect and neglect. Jacob goes on to describe how the offspring of the storks look after their parents' bodily needs, keep them warm, and help them to fly, as a repayment for their upbringing. His account is close to Basil's, who says that the example of such care from the stupidest birds should shame the most senseless human into behaving virtuously. Basil, in turn, had drawn on traditions about storks found in Aristotle and Aelian. The second example on storks is the orderly migration. Now, I don't have the handout to show you, but I was summarizing it anyway. Another feature of stork behavior that Jacob offers as an example is the mutual solidarity, vigilance, and orderly behavior that they display when they migrate to other places. Jacob says that this is equal to that of rational human beings. In this instance, we can detect some confusion in the transmission of sources. Orderliness, or eutaxia in Greek, I think it's metaxonoutho in Syriac, is a trait of cranes, Greek geranoi, that Basil praises, but it occurs just before Basil turns to speak about storks, which are pelagoi. Basil describes cranes taking turns to guard the group of storks at night, and this seems to have influenced Jacob's portrayal of storks as vigilant. Quite separately elsewhere, Jacob speaks of cranes being on guard duty for each other. So I think in this case, Jacob has muddled up something that he's found in Basil. He doesn't make an explicit moral point about the stork's orderly behaviour here, but he clearly admires it. Basil of Caesarea has a rhetorical address at this point. He says, "Who's given crows the laws of hospitality that they display towards the storks?" God, of course. "Who has threatened cranes with prosecution for deserting the storks?" God. "Let those who hate strangers and shut their doors to them pay attention to the example of the crow's protective alliance with the storks." That's all Basil. Jacob, in contrast, focuses on the storks and leaves the cranes out of it. And he only mentions the crows escorting the storks at the very end of the passage, and it seems to be almost tacked on as if he suddenly remembers to mention them. Now, the third example, again, since we don't have the handout, you can't see in detail, but I was summarizing it anyway. This is supposedly an example of the justice of storks, and I hope you find it as problematic as I do. The third example of Jacob's use of traditions about storks as moral examples makes for uncomfortable reading. Jacob presents it as a paradigm of justice superior to that of many human judges. Basically, a human being places a crow's egg in a stork's nest, and then the eggs hatch out. One of the chicks develops dark feathers. Now, the putative stork father suspects his mate of adultery. He calls together the other storks, who condemn the female stork and kill her along with the baby crow. Jacob praises storks for this attitude. The anecdote is really problematic. Even if death was an acceptable punishment for adultery, which in Christian communities it shouldn't be and probably wasn't in Jacob's day, the female stork was not guilty anyway, since the crow's egg was planted in her nest by a malicious human, and the chick never deserved to die either. Now, it did occur to me that maybe Jacob was being ironic, but I'm not sure that he was, which is worrying. And his approval of stork justice in this instance is very different from his own approach elsewhere. Jacob produced his own version of the story of Susanna as part of his kind of revision of the Old Testament texts. Susanna is an addition to the book of Daniel, which was not in the original corpus of the Peshitta, so he didn't need to include it if he didn't want to. And in Susanna, there you have a virtuous woman who is falsely accused of adultery by two malicious elders. In his canonical work, Jacob tells a correspondent that a mere accusation of adultery against someone is not enough for a priest to ban them from taking the Eucharist. You need firm evidence or an actual confession by one of the guilty parties. So hearsay is not enough. So perhaps Jacob's point about stork justice, here is that a court has been convened. It's not just a case of the male stork taking justice into his own hands. The actual origin of this horrible story is unclear. It's not in Basil, I should say. Aristotle doesn't have anything like it. Although Elian says that storks are jealous, he gives a completely different anecdote here. And a story that Elian produces about the mob justice of ringdoves and doves regarding sexual chastity is not actually comparable in any way to this story. Plutarch doesn't mention it either. There are a few similar references, however, in collections of Aesop's fables that were circulating in antiquity. The problem there is often the dates of these Aesiopica are not actually clear either, and we've got a much firmer date with Jacob. The most similar account to Jacob's, in fact, is found in medieval European literature, especially from Spain. The form of the tale with the motif of outside interference, meaning that the female stork is punished in spite of her total innocence, seems to be really later than Jacob's time. So at the moment, I haven't managed to discover the probable source, and Jacob, I think, is the earliest datable witness. And I should acknowledge some help from David Taylor, who was as intrigued as I was by this and helped me track down some of the early examples of vaguely comparable stories. Next, the compassion of the bearded vulture. It's difficult. I'm not even sure what a bearded vulture is, but I've seen pictures on Wikipedia. It was known as a phene in Greek, and phene is actually the Syriac transliteration that Jacob uses. And he presents it as an example of compassion reflecting God's own merciful nature. And Jacob at the same time condemns parental cruelty towards children. This is essentially a version of Basil's description, which describes how an eagle will eject one of its two chicks from the nest because it only has enough food for one of them, but that the bearded vulture saves the ejected chick and brings it up with its own offspring. The origin of this tradition seems to be Aristotle, who describes how the bearded vulture fosters the chicks jealously expelled by the eagle. Jacob's treatment diverges from Basil's to make a general theological point about the nature of God, also implying that humans should imitate the compassion of God and of the bearded vulture. In contrast, Basil used the example of the eagle and the bearded vulture to protest against the contemporary practice of the exposure of infants because of poverty, and also in rich families, the unfair distribution of inheritance among the children. Now, exposure of infants was banned in the Roman Empire just a few years after Basil had written his homilies. But for Jacob's society, it was no longer an issue, apparently, although neglect of children apparently still was a problem. The final example is the heron, or the egrets, they're apparently related birds, who loves choral worship. And I'd love to have seen the reaction of a heron in some of the wonderful kurbani and ramshay that we've had recently. Jacob has an extended description of the heron's quiet enjoyment of choral singing. This may hint at how Christians should behave correctly during church services. Now, I think I've got the text here. People say that the heron takes the greatest pleasure in hearing and being close to people singing hymns. The heron enters of its own accord and stands between the two choirs of singers and turns towards them, facing west. Sometimes it even falls asleep among them, tucking its head under its wings and standing on only one leg. However, in my opinion, although they say it is sleeping between the singers, it isn't actually asleep, but recollecting itself in silence in order to enjoy the sound of the voices of the people chanting praise. They say that it stands steadfastly immobile until they have finished the hymn that they are singing. When they have finished and moved to depart, the heron immediately cries out joyfully in praise. It flies above the ground, leaping and flapping its wings as it leaves the house with all those going out. It is also said of the heron that whenever it hears the sound of a mallet tapping on a sounding board, summoning the singers to gather, the bird jumps and leaps down, up and down, enthusiastically with loud cries. It is heard more clearly than the sounding board. In my opinion, this ought to act as a rebuke to indolent and lazy people who do not react with joy when they hear the sound of the Samantrum summoning them. So I will remember that at 6:30 in the morning. So. Now, there are no parallels to this anecdote in Basil, Elian, or Aristotle. Land's Leiden Physiologus does not overlap with Jacob's, except for this very last part, which I haven't, is on the handout, no, it's not here. And there's a theoria about the heron which envisages a monastic setting because it seems to advocate staying in a single monastery and not moving around from place to place. Jacob refers to the heron preferring to sleep in the same place, and I think that might hint at the same interpretation of trying to avoid peripatetic behaviour among monks. Jacob's fifth memra also describes insects at great length, especially bees, and uses them to inspire his readers to work hard like the bee and to glorify God for the wonderful knowledge he has given bees. Crickets, or grasshoppers, are an example of asceticism and self-denial, renunciation, poverty, chastity, lack of acquisitiveness, because they endure the summer without eating, and yet they continue to sing all day. Following Basil, Jacob also cites the silkworm as a type of the resurrection. However, when we move on to the next treatises in Basil and Jacob on the land animals, where there's a divergence of approach, where Basil is quite explicit at several points in his 9th homily about the need for humans to take lessons from dumb beasts. Jacob's 6th memra on the creation of land animals doesn't cite any of the marvellous creatures and their outstanding qualities as examples for Christians to imitate. He talks about how wonderful the animals are, but he doesn't say, well, you must be like this. It's not clear why Jacob used birds and insects as moral exemplars in Memra 5, just as Basil had done, and then apparently dropped this line of argument in Memra 6. Instead, in Memra 6, his debt to Basil of Caesarea's homilies can be seen in his emphasis on the degree to which each animal is of practical use to humans and serves their needs, thus fulfilling the divine command for animals to be subject to man. And since I'm in India, I should note that Jacob is even more fascinated by the elephant than Basil was, though I rather doubt that he ever saw one. In conclusion, Jacob's use of examples of admirable behaviour in birds and insects to provoke his readers into behaving in a more moral way is a little unexpected in what is essentially an exegetical and an encyclopedic series of treatises on the 6 days of creation. It is clearly due to the influence of Basil of Caesarea's famous homilies on the 6 days, which were much admired in antiquity and had been translated into Syriac in a loose translation, and Jacob, I'm sure, used the original Greek as well. However, Jacob composed the Hexa Amaren as a written legacy for his most advanced students, rather than as a series of sermons for a congregation of mixed gender, age, and educational levels, as Basil had done. So although Jacob keeps the rhetorical tone that Basil used, he makes his moral points more obliquely and generally, rather than directing them pointedly at his students on the whole. Although much of his material can be traced to Basil and to collections of animal law, the source of the passage about the superiority of stalk justice towards a supposed adulterous female is unclear, and at present, Jacob seems to be the earliest surviving source. Thank you.